My family moved to Memphis, Tennessee when I was 5 years old. And I cried all the way there because I wanted to stay with my mama.
It's 1949, and Myra Brown is saying goodbye to her extended family in rural Louisiana.
My daddy got a job as a lineman in Memphis.
Memphis, they say, is this sort of gateway into the Deep South. It really became this meeting point between white and black music, between country and early sort of rockabilly, hillbilly music, and African-American music, gospel and R&B. And the focal point for Memphis music at that time is Sam Phillips and Sun Records.
Myra's dad, J.W., is a bass player, and he's quick to discover that Memphis is an epicenter for a new kind of music, rock and roll.
Sam Phillips brought together many of the musicians from the South to create this new sound. He is the one who discovered Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. Sun Records, it's the birthplace of rock and roll.
When J.W. suffers a serious electrical accident at work, he gets a large settlement. It's the catalyst for a career change.
My daddy said, I'm going to go to Louisiana and find my cousin Jerry and see if he'll come to Memphis and we'll put together a band. He said, I've heard how great he is on the piano, how talented he is.
Only 21 years old, Jerry Lee Lewis has already been married twice. The first time when he was 16.
In the South, people got married young, that they started having kids really young, and that then they had a lot of them. That's the story of the Lewis family.
Jerry Lee now lives with his second wife, Jane, in Faraday, Louisiana.
Daddy found Jerry working at a little dive called the Wagon Wheel. Daddy went over and introduced himself and said, I would like for you to stay at my house as my guest. I'll take you to Sun Record, introduce you to Sam Phillips, and let's see about getting a contract. The phone rings, and I'm this 12-year-old kid. The man says, can I speak to J.W.? I need to get directions to your house. Jerry came in, and he was wearing a red plaid shirt. He had a haircut that was way too short because his ears stuck out. And he just looked like nothing special. But then he started playing the piano and immediately got my attention. It was like we were all mesmerized because he was just so good on the piano. My opinion changed drastically of him. His haircut didn't matter anymore.
I was 3 years old when he moved into our house. And they practiced in the living room for a while, and his hands were so fast, it was just like they were in double motion. It was like he had 4 hands. It was just hard to believe that he could play it like that. And the man was a great musician.
Then Daddy took Jerry to Sun Records and had him audition. And that's how it all began. His first record was End of the Road and Crazy Arms. One day in the studio, my daddy said to him, Jerry, play that Shakin' song. Because when they were traveling and doing shows, Jerry would do that song and the audience would just react like crazy. And that was Whole Lotta Shakin'. And the first time Sam heard it, it was like, this is it, you know.
Myra has just turned 13 when her dad and Jerry fly to New York with their band to make their debut on live national television.
Mom and I were at home watching television, and you knew something great was coming out of this.
Come on over, baby. A whole lot of shaking going on.
guess seeing him on Steve Allen's show, he rose in my mind, to a higher level.
It is safe to say that the overwhelming majority of the network TV viewing audience would never have seen anything like Jerry Lee Lewis before in their lives.
Oh, shake, baby. You can shake one time for me.
And for a young girl growing up in the South, just the notion that you would know somebody who would be on television was almost beyond imagination.
I was 13 years old. He became a little god in my mind and in a lot of people's mind at that time.
And when a whole lot of shaking hit, they went up to $10,000 a show. Now this is in the 50s, that's a lot of money.
Clearly, Steve Allen got a kick out of him. Very soon after, he booked him to come back on.
Mr. Commotion himself, Jerry Lee Lewis.
So to get a second bite at that apple, national television, that was a big deal.
Goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
As Jerry's fame skyrockets, his marriage falls apart.
He knew what time school let out, and he would go up there. He'd say, hey, you want to go get some ice cream? And he always knew I wanted to go get ice cream. Jerry and I, we would go to a movie after dinner or something like that. I thought he was being nice to a kid. I thought it was that kind of thing. Like pat the kid on top of the head or something. I was idolizing Jerry and looking up to him and thinking he's this great big star. What I didn't know was that he was falling in love with me.
Myra's parents had no idea that Jerry Lee was wooing their daughter. They knew the two had fun together, they knew they were friends, but it truly didn't occur to them that this older man would try to have a relationship with their child.
After supper or something, we'd drive up to the A&W or whatever it is. And Jerry would kiss me. At first, I didn't know what to think about that. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused. I was like, I'm 13 years old. So it really messes with your mind. You don't understand what's going on. But you don't want it to stop either, because it was you liked it. But that's how our relationship was.
Jerry never asked Myra to get married, per se. He got the marriage license by taking this older friend, I think she was in her 20s as well, to the courthouse and having her sign Myra's name to the license. Nobody questioned it. Apparently they didn't ask for ID back in those days.
And Jerry came back home. He said, come outside, I'm gonna show you something. So he pulled this paper out, and I looked at it, and it said, marriage license. And I looked at it, and I said, you mean we're married? And he said, no. We're not married, we're gonna get married. And I said, what? And he caught me by my arm, and he turned me around, and he said, Myra, I love you, and I want to marry you. And I think I just melted, I think it just, and I told him, and I said, no, I love you too. I said, but I'm still too young. This is crazy.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator. He wanted somebody he could mold into whoever he wanted. Myra was a good, dutiful girl, and so she was an easy mark for him.
December 12th, 1957 marks a crazy new chapter in 13-year-old Myra Brown's life.
We were having supper. Jerry said, Myra, you want to go to a movie? I said, yeah, sure. We got in the car, and Jerry headed toward Mississippi. And I'm going, was there a movie theater out this way? And he said, no, we're going to get married. He had found this pastor or whoever it was that was going to marry us. And I think I was in a coma. I think my eyes were like this. And I got out of the car. I had on the red dress that I wore to school that day. And we walked in this little chapel. I don't remember getting married, but I know it happened. And then these two little old ladies started throwing rice at us and all this kind of stuff. And I'm still like a deer caught in headlights. Now, we've gone down there and gotten married and turned around and came right back. And we were probably gone less than an hour. The next morning, I got up and I pulled my marriage license out, and I left them laying out on the nightstand. And my mother's maid found them. And she handed my daddy the marriage license. And of course, he took one look at it. And my daddy went and got his gun. And he said, I'm gonna go kill that son of a bitch.
He got in the car and took off. And Jerry was up at Sun Records at that time. Mama called Sam Phillips and said, Jay's on the way and he's got a gun. Is Jerry still there?
And Sam turned around and he looked at Jerry and he said, get in your car and get out of Memphis. So Jerry took off. Daddy drives up, barrels through the front door and says, where is that son of a bitch? And Sam sits Daddy down and tells him, we can't interfere in this life decision that's been made without you.
And he said, it looks to me like they love each other. And if we charge him, he's going to prison for a long time.
Daddy calms down and he goes back home and he tells Mom, we really don't have any choices because it's done. And we're going to have to hope for the best and learn to live with it.
It's against the law for married women to go to school in Tennessee. So 13-year-old Myra joins Jerry out on tour.
I didn't have a suitcase. The only thing I had was this round doll case that I had gotten at a Christmas or two before. And it was like a hat box, shaped like a hat box. And that's what I put my stuff in.
The next time JW sees Jerry is on stage at a gig in New York.
Jerry goes over to Daddy and he says, I love Myra, I'll take care of her. Music starts playing and it's accepted, it's forgotten. We went out and bought a little house. Actually, we bought the first house that had a for sale sign on it because we needed a house right away. I learned how to cook and learned how to vacuum. I had to become the adult. Jerry did two things. He played music and he loved me. He came home, he brought all the money to me, dumped it in my lap.
I mean, it was a cash business. And Myra was in charge of taking the bags full of cash from his live performances to the bank. You really are talking about shopping bags with dollar bills in them. The notion that she was a central piece of keeping the Jerry Lee Lewis business going as a young teenager, as a girl, is pretty wild.
The first few months of 1958 tick by, and Jerry's star continues to rise.
It was a time that had never happened before, never will happen again. And the reaction of the public and the audience that made me kind of gasp. Like, look at how these people are just going berserk about him.
There for a while, he was the top dog. They had the top songs in the world.
Out of all of these figures, these kings of rock and roll, Elvis was a brilliant performer. He was cute. He had this sort of angel face. But Jerry Lee Lewis could play the piano better than anyone that was a part of this whole Sun Records crew. And Jerry Lee Lewis was fun. And fun was a huge part of the birth of rock and roll.
Private Elvis Presley makes this a VIP event. But the rock and roll star, wearing medals for carbine, pistol, and tank gunnery marksmanship, is modest as can be.
When Elvis is drafted into the Army, Jerry Lee is poised to become the new king of rock and roll.
And then they booked a big tour for Jerry in Europe in May of '58.
Elvis never went to England. Elvis never formed off of United States soil. So for one of those first-generation rock and rollers to make that trip and go over to England was a big deal.
The tour will be a surefire success if Jerry will heed the advice of Sam Phillips and not do one thing.
Don't bring Myra on tour with you. Don't bring her to London. And he ignored all of that good advice. His ego, I think, stood in the way. He just thought he was untouchable.
I didn't even know that Jerry had been warned. And he said to them, either she goes or I don't. And I think Jerry intimidated him and said, don't you talk to her. Leave my wife alone.
Myra, her brother Rusty, and their mom Lois accompany the band to England.
When we got there, they were standing there at the airport and, people just wanted to see everybody, because we were the biggest celebrities there was at that time.
The press was going to come on the plane and see Jerry and interview him. So I got off, and I'm walking around in the airport, and a man comes up to me, and he says, who are you, miss? You got off that plane, didn't you? And I said, I'm not anybody. He said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm Jerry's wife. And the guy asked me how old I was, and I said, I'm 15. I figured I could lie a little bit. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he took off. I had no idea. I was talking to a reporter. And I'm clueless that there could be a problem. I wish that somebody would have said, if people find out Jerry's married to a kid, it ain't gonna be pretty. Myra, you're a bomb.
It's May 1958, and the news of 13-year-old Myra Lewis's marriage to Jerry Lee is about to erupt in the British press. Initially, Jerry's British fans give him a warm reception.
They were at the airport. They were out in the streets. They were in the lobby. People loved Jerry so much, they were hanging out of the hotel windows all around our hotel.
But the tone abruptly changes the following day.
The reporter followed up, figured out Myra was 13, figured out she was his cousin, and that Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't actually even divorced from his second wife yet. This was a bombshell.
The next morning, the news media said, Jerry Lee Lewis is here with his child bride, Myra.
He's a pedophile, he's a bigamist, he's a liar and a fraud. There's a call to boycott the shows, and very quickly, Jerry Lee finds himself playing to half-empty theaters where people are heckling and booing him.
And they went after Jerry Lee, they went after Myra. She was in the car with her mother and her little brother. The paparazzi surrounded the car and they were shaking it so violently, they thought the car was going to be turned over.
And Scotland Yard came to the hotel and told us, we can't guarantee your safety.
They end up coming back to America, where they hoped it would blow over, but nothing blew over.
Why did you leave?
Well, I don't answer those questions, sir. My manager might knock my head off or something.
That one event turned our life upside down and changed the direction of everything. Nobody wanted to be a part of this.
Were you there, Mrs. Lewis?
I was there, but I wasn't at the show.
Oh, you weren't at the shows. Oh, did you notice anything like that sort of reception?
No, it was a very good reception, I thought.
He went from making thousands of dollars a night down to making a few $100s a night. I felt guilty because of it. I didn't make it happen, but I didn't stop it from happening. And I could have, because I was the one that let the cat out of the bag.
After they came back and after his divorce was finalized, he remarried Myra so that there was no question that this was a marriage in good standing, but the damage was done.
It destroyed a man's career, but it didn't destroy our marriage. If anything, it made it stronger because we were attacked. We don't care what the world says or does. We should love each other.
Soon, Myra is overjoyed to learn that she's pregnant.
I always loved children. What I had wanted all my life was a house, a home, and a baby.
But a few months into her pregnancy, Myra is forced to leave her home.
Jerry wasn't having the income that he had, and he was the sole supporter of his mother, father, and 2 sisters. So my house got shut down, not theirs. And I had to go live with them in Faraday, Louisiana. It was not comfortable because they resented the fact that Jerry married me. It was not a fun situation to live in the house with those people. One day, Jerry walked into the room and he reached down and he picked up my typewriter and he held it above his head like he was gonna slam it down on me. And I looked up at him and it's like, what happened? And he threw it on the floor. And he said, one of his sisters, Linda Gale, told me that she was with you the other day and y'all were driving down the road and you were smoking a cigarette and flirting with a sailor. Neither one was true. The only reason she would tell him that was to make him mad at me.
But all is forgiven when Myra gives birth to a baby boy on February 27th, 1959.
Myra had Stevie when she was 14 years old, and she was thrilled. She knew she was pretty young to be having one, but still, it was what she always wanted.
Oh, he was precious. He was a sweet baby. He was a smart baby. Jerry wanted to name him after Steve Allen for giving him his first break on nationwide television.
Myra is over the moon when they move back to Memphis and her mom, dad, and brother get to meet her baby boy.
It was great because it was like I had a little brother, you know, because I was with him all the time. You know, and she was a great mama.
In 1960, the Lewises learn that Elvis has returned to Memphis from his stint in the Army. And just like Jerry, Elvis has fallen in love with a teenage girl.
Elvis Presley was in love with Priscilla when he was 24 and she was 14. Luckily for him, he had Jerry Lee Lewis's example.
Clearly, Elvis's team learned from the disaster of Jerry Lee and Myra and entered into the relationship with Priscilla in a very different way. Waited much longer on the marriage.
Priscilla Presley was beautiful and glamorous and did her hair and her makeup and was in the public eye. Jerry Lee didn't want Myra to be anything like Priscilla Presley. Myra was only to belong to him. He didn't want other men to be attracted to Myra in any way. Jerry Lee wanted Myra to be invisible.
I couldn't wear shorts. We had a swimming pool, and he didn't want me going swimming when there was other men out there. It was so uncalled for.
Only 17 years old, Myra submits to Jerry's demands and embraces her role as wife and mother. But nothing prepares her for what happens on Easter Sunday, 1962.
Myra was at home with her 3-year-old son, Stevie, her father-in-law, Elmo, and Jerry's uncle, George, and she was going to cook dinner. And she was asking Elmo what he wanted, and he was listing some things, and said, well, we better go inside and make a list. So she asked Uncle George, would you watch Stevie? And he said, sure. And so she and Elmo went inside, and she wrote a grocery list. They went back outside.
And Uncle George was there, and Stevie wasn't. And I said, Uncle George, where'd Stevie go? He said, he went in the house with you. Well, didn't he go in the house with you? I ran in the house to look for him. And I came back out. There was this, he'd been playing with a hose. And he'd been pulling it. And I followed the hose around the house. And I looked, and the hose was in the swimming pool. And the water was rippling. And I started screaming.
Myra Lewis is 17 years old when her 3-year-old son drowns in a tragic accident.
Myra remembers almost nothing between the incident at the pool and the funeral. What she remembers is Jerry Lee picking her up off of Stevie's grave. She was lying on his grave and wouldn't leave because she wouldn't leave her child alone.
I was so heartbroken over losing Stevie. I mean, it was the most God's awful thing could happen to any human on this earth.
There were times when she didn't want to go on. She didn't know if she could live without her baby, without her child. And then she got pregnant again. And it was with the birth of Phoebe that she realized she had to stay alive.
She just unbroke my heart. You know, she made me proud and happy to have a child again in my arms that I could hold and kiss, and gave me back something that I had lost. It was a welcoming, wonderful thing that happened.
In 1964, the Beatles conquer America and transform the sound of rock and roll. By this time, unable to repeat his success on the charts, Jerry Lee has left Sun Records. At home, he becomes increasingly controlling.
No matter what she did to try to please him, it was never enough. Nothing was ever good enough.
It ripped my self-esteem away from me. One night, Jerry was coming home, but I didn't know he was coming home that night. He said, I'm hungry, you gotta fix me something to eat. Okay. When a neighbor had made some spaghetti sauce for me, and I walked by him and he said, this don't taste like your spaghetti. And I said, Bonnie made it and gave it to me. And he said, what? And he picked his tray up and threw it at me.
Jerry's bad behavior continues, even when he starts making a comeback in a new genre in the 1960s.
Who's gonna play this old piano after I'm not here?
He never returns as a rock and roll star, but eventually moves into a much more straight-ahead country style.
When country music kind of became outlaw country and was more sort of open to rebellious figures, they welcomed Jerry Lee Lewis.
I started playing with him a lot and then went full time with him later on, you know, after I got out of high school.
When Another Place, Another Time shoots up the country charts in 1968, Jerry's career is on the ascent.
Jerry went from a little bit of success to more success to really being one of the most successful recording artists in the country music community by sort of the end of the 60s.
Jerry's second chance at fame is not enough to right his failing marriage.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. Jerry would turn into Jekyll and Hyde. Mid-afternoon, when Jerry was gone and going to play a show that night, I'd talk to him. And he'd say things like, "Hey, babe, what you doing?" Da-da-da-da-da. We'd just chit-chat, you know, normal. After the show, I could get a phone call from him. "Who the hell do you think you are telling me that I shouldn't drink liquor or something like this?" The next morning, Jerry would wake up and call me and say, "Hey, babe, what you doing?" Jekyll and Hyde.
Jerry Lee, while he was on the road, began taking drugs, and Myra noticed a drastic difference in him. He would just be totally out of control, accusing her of cheating on him while he was out of town, which was totally not Myra. He had no evidence whatsoever. He was just high on drugs.
I would imagine Myra feeling completely overwhelmed and confused. These were prescription pills, you know, they were sort of like performance enhancers. They were marketed from doctors. There wasn't the knowledge that we have today. He became a raw nerve, yelling, screaming. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis had a terrible temper and a lot of conflict, but you take all of that and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze and sleeplessness, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
Yeah, he slapped me. Yeah, he did. That's what he would do to people. He'd slap them in the face. But when he slapped me, I would end up on the floor because the force was too hard.
Then, 12 years into her marriage, Myra gets a phone call that will ultimately destroy the relationship. Jerry Lee has been living a double life.
I just fell apart. I couldn't take another day of it.
In 1970, Myra Lewis gets a phone call that shatters her belief in Jerry Lee.
The anonymous phone call was that Jerry had been seeing other women and just picking up women on the road, and it was something that had been ongoing for many years.
In fact, he had started cheating on her only 11 months after they first got married.
Myra is devastated. She runs down to her local church to seek solace.
I knelt down at the altar and I was crying so hard that I was not even able to say a word. But that was the moment of knowing without a doubt that this was not the man I was going to spend my life with. This was not what I bargained for. I think maybe in my heart I knew that it wasn't reasonable that a man goes out and plays music and drinks and takes drugs and there's women throwing themselves at him. It's not reasonable to think he's not gonna take advantage of that. But I could, because he told me he didn't. And when I realized that it was a lie, and it had been a lie for a very long time, I knew there was no going back.
Jerry is out of town. By the time he gets home, Myra and Phoebe have moved in with JW and Lois.
Jerry was continuously calling me, want me to come back to him and all this kind of stuff. And I went over to the house to get something, and I went in and I was in the den and I heard somebody going, "Get her out the window." Jerry was in our bedroom with a girl in his bed. And I walked in there and said, "Oh, no, yeah, you miss me and you love me and you want me back, right? And this is what you're doing, laying in my bed with another woman." So I mean, I'd been gone 2 or 3 days.
He begged her to come back, but she wasn't falling for it.
And that's when she got that apartment. I went over and stayed with her while she was staying there, and they was getting her divorced. I was asleep, and I heard glass break. And I ran down the stairs, and it was Jerry. He was trying to come through the window. Jerry saw me, and I said, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "I just need to talk to Maya so you don't talk to her coming through the window."
I was married at 13, divorced at 26. Half of my life was spent with Jerry.
The leaving, of course, was hard. She had no education. She wasn't going to have any money because Jerry Lee didn't manage money well, and whatever they had, it was spent whenever he made it. She did get some child support as long as she would go beg for it. Jerry did see Phoebe on a regular basis. Myra always felt absolutely certain that keeping that relationship between the father and daughter was an important thing to do.
Myra relocates to Atlanta, Georgia. But as she starts to rebuild her life, Jerry starts to unravel. He's arrested for driving under the influence several times.
I was taking a lot of pills at the time, you know. Nobody had mentioned it to me or said anything about it, and I didn't know that I was in that bad a shape.
Jerry has numerous weapons violations and accidentally shoots his bass player while drunk.
Just a couple of months after shooting his bass player, Jerry Lee shows up, drunk and belligerent at Graceland, smashes his car into the front gates, is yelling for Elvis to come down, and pulls out his gun and starts firing that, and then is hauled in and arrested for that. That was the next example of chaos.
That was kind of around the same time when I decided to go into real estate. I'm here by myself. I've got a child to raise. What do I want to do?
She went back to school, got her GED. She then got her real estate license and eventually her broker's license. Myra was very successful in real estate in Atlanta, Georgia.
I was in the President's Club every year. I was a $1 million producer, and I loved every second of it.
She worked for Richard Williams. She was an agent in his firm. He was a divorced man, and she admired him immensely. And after 4 years, one day, he asked her to lunch, and the sparks flew, apparently, because they ended up getting married.
Richard Williams and I were married on June 1984. He's a gentleman. He's kind. He'll do anything in the world for me. He vacuums. I have somebody I can take care of and somebody that I know is going to take care of me. And it took a long time to get to it all, but it's been what I want.
After Myra's marriage to Richard, most news of Jerry continues to be troubling.
There are a series of marriages, many of which just end in terrible and tragic or suspect circumstances. One wife dies under very sketchy circumstances that, as reporters investigate, point toward his guilt and culpability in her death. And none of this is ever, in any serious way, investigated or explored by the authorities.
Really, sincerely, I would like to say one more time what a great honor it is to be back in London, England. I feel like it's at home to me, you know. Well, this is where I first come over and I brought my little 13-year-old cousin with me. Remember that?
He was widely celebrated. He was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the first class. Jerry Lee also was very distinct within that first generation of rock and roll. First of all, he stayed alive longer than the rest of them, but Jerry Lee Lewis was also in a class of his own when it came to bad behavior.
But then what's behind that is this remarkable woman who took something from that, who took something beyond just being scarred by it and, was able to turn her life into something else.
I mean, there's been so many blessings and so many good things and so much good spread through our life that you got to focus on that. I'm happy with myself right now. I'm happy with what I've got. I've learned some tremendous lessons about life. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably do it all over again.
It begins with a silence that feels too heavy for a suburban street. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every shadow look suspicious. A silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the flicker of a porch light that should have turned off hours ago. Because inside that house, in the early hours of a California morning in 1989, something went wrong in a way that no one would fully understand for decades. And even now, with the case officially stamped solved, the unease lingers like a stain that refuses to wash out. Police would later say the first sign was the door slightly ajar, not forced open, not smashed, just open enough to suggest familiarity, trust, or a fatal mistake. And when officers stepped inside, the air felt wrong, thick, stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that seasoned detectives recognize instantly but never grow comfortable with. The smell of violence after it has already happened. The victim was found where no one expects to die, in a place meant for rest, safety, routine, and the scene told a story without words, furniture undisturbed, valuables untouched, no sign of a struggle that neighbors could recall, which immediately raised the question that would haunt investigators for years. How does someone vanish into death without waking the block, without triggering alarms, without leaving a trail that points cleanly in any direction? Outside, the neighborhood slowly woke up to flashing lights and whispered speculation, curtains shifting as people peeked out, recognizing police cars but refusing to believe what they implied, because this was California suburbia at the tail end of the 80s, a place defined by predictability, lawns trimmed on weekends, kids riding bikes in the afternoon, a place where crime was something that happened elsewhere on the evening news, not on your street, not behind a door you had walked past 100 times. The victim's name spread quickly, spoken first in hushed tones, then in disbelief, then in the kind of shocked repetition that signals the moment when a community realizes it will never feel quite the same again. And almost immediately, investigators began doing what they always do, sealing off the scene, photographing every angle, collecting fibers, fingerprints, anything that might speak later when witnesses could not. But 1989 was a different era, a time when DNA was more promise than powerhouse, when forensic science was still catching up to the ambition of its own theories, and while evidence was collected, carefully bagged, labeled, and logged, much of it would sit dormant, its true value unrealized, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Did you hear anything? See anyone unfamiliar? Notice a car parked where it shouldn't have been? And the answers followed a familiar pattern. No, maybe, I'm not sure. A community stunned into uncertainty, memories blurring under the weight of fear and hindsight. Attention quickly turned inward, as it often does, toward those closest to the victim, because statistics are cruelly consistent, and investigators know that the greatest danger often comes from within the circle of trust. So family members were interviewed, friends questioned, relationships dissected under fluorescent lights, every word measured, every pause scrutinized for meaning that might not exist. Yet nothing stuck. No confession. No weapon. No eyewitness willing or able to point a finger with confidence. The case files began to thicken, filled with notes, timelines, dead ends, and the kind of marginal scribbles that betray mounting frustration, because each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny, alibis checked out, tips dried up, suspects faded into background noise, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, urgency gave way to routine. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. And the headlines changed. What had once dominated the local news slipped to the inside pages, then vanished entirely, replaced by fresher tragedies, newer crimes, because that is how time works, it moves forward without waiting for justice to catch up. But for the family, time froze. Birthdays passed with empty chairs. Holidays came and went under a cloud of absence. And every unanswered question became a weight carried daily. A reminder that somewhere out there, someone knew what happened, someone was living a normal life with a secret that had destroyed another. Inside the police department, the case was officially classified the way so many others are when momentum dies and answers refuse to surface, stamped, filed, and quietly relegated to a category that carries its own quiet dread. Cold case. Not solved. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Waiting for a mistake. Waiting for a confession. Waiting for science to catch up with silence. Years later, new detectives would flip through the file, their fingers tracing photographs that had yellowed slightly with age, reading reports written by men and women long retired, some no longer alive, and they would feel the same chill, the same sense that something was missing, something obvious that everyone had somehow overlooked. They would notice details that once seemed insignificant, a biological sample taken almost as an afterthought, a swab logged and stored because protocol demanded it, not because anyone believed it would change everything, and in that overlooked evidence, dormant and patient, the truth waited. Outside the station, the world changed. Technology evolved. DNA databases expanded. Computers grew faster. And what had once been impossible became routine. But for decades, no one connected those advances back to the quiet house in California where a life had ended without explanation, because cold cases have a way of slipping between the cracks, living in the space between hope and resignation, until one day, someone decides to look again. And when that moment finally came, it did not arrive with fanfare or certainty, but with a simple request, almost casual, buried in paperwork, a decision to retest old evidence using new methods, to ask modern science a question that had been posed 34 years earlier and left unanswered. At the time, no one could have predicted the shockwaves that single decision would send through a community that thought it had moved on, or how a name long absent from the conversation would suddenly return, heavy with implication, threatening to rewrite everything people thought they knew about that night in 1989. Because cold cases do not truly sleep. They wait. It resumes not with revelation but with routine, the kind of quiet procedural grind that rarely makes headlines, a detective alone in a records room flipping through boxes that smell faintly of dust and cardboard, labels typed on machines that no longer exist, names frozen in ink, dates that feel unreal simply because of how long ago they were written, and somewhere in that stack, the California 1989 cold case breathes again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind anyone who touches it that it was never finished. The evidence room is cold by design, temperature-controlled, sealed, clinical, and inside a long-forgotten container rests a biological sample taken from the crime scene, collected carefully but without expectation, because in 1989 DNA was still a gamble, a future promise, not the near-miraculous identifier it would later become, and so the sample was logged, stored, preserved, and then left alone as years stacked up like sediment. When the decision is made to send it for reanalysis, it does not feel historic in the moment, it feels administrative, another form, another barcode, another chain of custody signature. But this is how cold cases turn, not on grand gestures, but on quiet persistence and technology finally catching up to the patience of the dead. Weeks pass. Then months. And then a call comes in, brief, clipped, the kind of tone that makes experienced investigators sit up straight without knowing why. Because the lab has something, not a full answer yet, not a name but a profile, partial at first, incomplete but real, and for the first time in over 3 decades the case exhales. A DNA profile means possibility. It means comparison. It means databases. And suddenly, the crime scene from 1989 is no longer trapped in the past. It is alive in the present, interfacing with systems that did not exist when the victim took their last breath. The profile is uploaded, then checked again. Then cross-referenced. First nothing. False starts. Near matches that collapse under scrutiny. But investigators know this rhythm well, the slow tightening of a net that may or may not ever close, and they keep going because cold cases teach a specific kind of patience, the kind that accepts disappointment as part of the process. Then comes the hit. Not a name yet, but a familial connection, distant enough to make hearts race and coffee go cold on desks. Because this is how modern cases crack open, not with confessions, but with bloodlines, genetic echoes linking the present to a crime long buried. Genealogists step in, not detectives in trench coats, but specialists with spreadsheets and family trees, tracing ancestry backward and outward, mapping relationships like a cartographer of secrets, identifying branches, siblings, cousins, People who have no idea they are about to be pulled into a story that began before some of them were even born. Names surface, then narrow again, until one name refuses to go away. A name that appeared once in the original file briefly dismissed for lack of evidence, an acquaintance, not a suspect, someone who lived nearby, moved away, lived a life that, on paper, looked ordinary, unremarkable, safe. The kind of life that never makes police blotters. The kind of life that blends in. Investigators pull records, old addresses, employment history, marriages, divorces, traffic violations, anything that might sketch a silhouette of the person behind the name, and what they see is unsettling not because it screams guilt but because it doesn't. No violent history.
No habeas motive documented.
No trail of chaos. Just proximity, opportunity, and time. The most dangerous combination. Surveillance begins quietly because you don't knock on a door with only probability in hand. You watch, you listen, you confirm, and as days stretch into weeks, the suspect moves through their routine unaware, grocery stores, gas stations, casual conversations, living proof that a person can carry a past no one else can see. Investigators collect what they need the old-fashioned way: discarded items, a coffee cup, a cigarette, but something touched, something abandoned, something that carries the final piece of the puzzle. And when that DNA is tested against the profile from the crime scene, the weight feels heavier than the 34 years that preceded it. The result arrives quietly.
No drumroll. No announcement.
Just confirmation. A match. The room goes still. Because this is the moment cold cases promise but rarely deliver, the instant when the abstract becomes specific, when decades of speculation collapse into a single human being, flesh and bone, breathing, aging, existing in the same world as the people who never stop grieving. An arrest warrant is drafted, reviewed, signed. The date on it feels surreal, a modern timestamp paired with a crime that happened when cassette tapes and payphones still define daily life. And when officers finally move in, it is early morning again, history repeating itself with cruel symmetry. The arrest is calm.
No chase.
No resistance. Just confusion etched into an aging face as handcuffs close around wrists that had been free for 34 years. And somewhere across town, a family receives a call they never believed would come, telling them the cold case is no longer cold, that the waiting may finally mean something. News spreads fast. Neighbors who never knew the victim but knew the suspect feel the ground shift beneath them, replaying memories, wondering what they missed, questioning the illusion of safety that comes from familiarity, because the most disturbing realization is not that a killer was caught, but that they were there all along. And as cameras gather and headlines form, investigators know the story is not over, because an arrest answers only one question, and leaves many others screaming for attention, questions about motive, about silence, about how a life can fracture and yet appear whole, and most haunting of all, how many other cold cases are still waiting for science, patience, and one overlooked detail to finally speak. The past has collided with the present, and the shockwave is only beginning. The interrogation room does not look like justice, it looks like beige walls and a table scarred by decades of knuckles tapping in frustration, a single light humming overhead, and a man sitting alone with his hands folded, older now, slower, the weight of years etched into his face, but inside that room time collapses, because the questions being prepared are 34 years old, and they have waited patiently for this moment. Detectives enter without drama, no accusations yet, no raised voices, because they know the power of silence, how it presses in, how it forces memories to surface whether they are wanted or not. And when they say the victim's name, carefully, deliberately, the reaction is almost imperceptible, a flicker in the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, something small but unmistakable. The kind of response that doesn't prove guilt on its own but never appears in the innocent. They talk about 1989. About California. About where he lived. About who he knew. They let him talk. And he does. He talks about jobs, about moves, about relationships, about a life that kept going while another one ended. And listening to him, it becomes painfully clear how easy it is for time to bury things, how routine can cover almost anything, how the extraordinary can disappear inside the ordinary if no one forces it back into the light. Then they introduce the science. Not theatrically. Just facts. DNA. The crime scene. The match. The room changes. It always does. Because denial can survive rumors, suspicions, even accusations, but it rarely survives numbers, probabilities, the cold certainty of genetic code that does not forget, does not forgive, does not lie, and for the first time the man stops talking. Silence stretches. Seconds feel longer than years. And when he finally speaks again, his voice is different, slower, heavier, as if every word must pass through layers of memory and regret before reaching the air. He doesn't confess. Not yet. Instead, he asks questions. How? When? Who else knows? Because even now, even after decades, self-preservation clings tightly, and investigators recognize this phase well. The moment when the wall cracks but does not fall, when truth circles the room without landing. They leave him alone again. They always do. Because sometimes the hardest interrogator is time itself. The awareness that the past has finally caught up, that whatever protection age once provided is gone, replaced by inevitability. Outside the room, detectives review the case again, this time through a different lens, re-examining old witness statements, forgotten tips, moments that once seemed meaningless now vibrating with potential relevance, and patterns emerge that no one could see before because they were looking without context. A neighbor's vague recollection, a car seen briefly, a comment dismissed as gossip. Pieces shift. A line. And suddenly the story begins to form a shape that feels terrifyingly complete. They learn about a connection that was downplayed in the original investigation, a fleeting interaction between suspect and victim, nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed danger, just enough to establish access, familiarity, trust, and that is often all it takes. Motive remains elusive. There is no clear trigger, no documented conflict, no financial desperation or public argument, and this absence is unsettling, because it forces a darker possibility into focus, that sometimes violence is not born from chaos but from impulse, from a moment that spins out of control and then calcifies into secrecy. As pressure mounts, the suspect's family is pulled into the orbit of the case. Adult children learning that the father they knew is now the center of a headline that reads like a nightmare, spouses grappling with questions they never imagined asking, and this ripple effect is something cold cases never prepare anyone for. The collateral damage that explodes decades later without warning. The suspect's attorney arrives. Statements are controlled now. Conversations become guarded. But the damage is done. Because DNA does not need narrative. It does not require motive. Simply exists. And in court filings, in motions, in legal language stripped of emotion, the truth begins to take on an official shape, one that will soon be tested in front of a judge, a jury, and a public hungry for resolution. Meanwhile, the victim's family stands at a crossroads they never believed they would reach. Relief tangled with rage, validation mixed with grief. Because answers do not heal wounds, they reopen them, exposing everything that was buried under the assumption that justice would never come. They revisit memories. They reread old articles. They replay the night their world changed. And now, with a name attached to the pain, the past feels closer than ever. Media coverage intensifies. The phrase cold case dominates headlines again, paired with words like DNA breakthrough and arrest after 34 years. But beneath the spectacle lies an uncomfortable truth, that this resolution arrives too late to restore what was taken, too late to stop decades of unanswered questions, too late to give the victim the future that was erased. As the legal process moves forward, investigators brace for scrutiny, because solving a case does not shield it from doubt, and every step taken in 1989 will be dissected with modern eyes. Every missed opportunity magnified, every decision questioned, and they know some criticisms will be fair. But beneath it all, one fact remains immovable, that without patience, without preservation of evidence, without the relentless march of science, this case would still be a name in a box, a tragedy frozen in time. Instead, it breathes again. And as the suspect sits in a cell, alone with memories he cannot outrun, the community begins to understand that the shock they feel is not just about what happened, but about what didn't happen sooner, about how close justice came to never arriving at all. The case is moving forward, but the truth is still unfolding. Court dates are scheduled, postponed, rescheduled again because the justice system moves at a pace that feels almost cruel when set against the speed of grief, and every delay stretches the tension tighter, forcing everyone involved to live inside the story longer than they want to, longer than they ever imagined they would have to. In pretrial hearings, the past is reconstructed piece by piece, not as memory but as evidence, photographs projected onto screens, grainy, imperfect, artifacts from a time before high-definition truth. And as lawyers argue over admissibility and procedure, The emotional gravity of the case presses against the room, an invisible presence that no objection can remove. The defense challenges the DNA. They have to. They question contamination, chain of custody, the reliability of methods that didn't exist in 1989, suggesting that science, for all its power, is still wielded by human hands capable of error. And for a moment doubt flickers, not because the evidence is weak, but because the stakes are so high that even certainty feels fragile. Prosecutors respond calmly, methodically, explaining preservation protocols, storage conditions, retesting procedures, the improbability of coincidence, translating genetic certainty into language a jury can understand. And as they speak, it becomes clear that this case is no longer just about one murder, but about the evolution of justice itself, about whether time erodes truth or merely delays it. Outside the courthouse, cameras wait. Commentators speculate. Neighbors offer interviews filled with disbelief and hindsight, phrases like "he seemed normal," and "we never suspected a thing," repeating until they lose meaning. Because normalcy, it turns out, is not evidence of innocence, just a mask that can last a lifetime. Inside the holding cell, the suspect waits, days measured by routine, meals sliding through slots, footsteps echoing in corridors, and in that enforced stillness, the past grows louder, memories no longer softened by distance, moments replayed without mercy, because the mind, when stripped of distraction, has nowhere left to hide. Investigators continue working even as the case moves toward trial, chasing remaining questions not because they doubt the outcome, but because they need to understand the full shape of what happened, how the crime unfolded minute by minute, how the suspect entered, how they left, what was said, what was never spoken, filling in gaps not for conviction, but for truth. They revisit the house. It has changed owners. Walls repainted. Rooms reconfigured. But standing there, they trace the past over the present, imagining the night as it was, the silence, the decision point, the moment when everything tipped from ordinary into irreversible. And this exercise is not procedural, it is human, an attempt to grasp how violence inserts itself into normal life without warning. Witnesses from 1989 are located where possible, older now, voices softer, memories blurred, and some decline to speak, not out of indifference but exhaustion, because carrying a piece of someone else's tragedy for decades leaves its own scars. Those who do talk offer fragments, impressions, emotions more than facts, and yet, combined, these fragments add texture to a story that once felt flat, reminding everyone involved that this was not just a case file, but a living moment that rippled outward into countless lives. The victim's family prepares for trial with a mixture of resolve and dread, knowing that justice requires exposure, that details long avoided will be spoken aloud, dissected, debated, and the thought of hearing the final moments described by strangers feels unbearable, yet necessary. They attend hearings. They sit quietly. They listen. And every word lands. As opening statements approach, tension sharpens because trials promise closure but often deliver something messier. A public reckoning that replaces private grief with collective judgment. And no outcome can rewrite the past, only define how it will be remembered. The defense strategy becomes clearer, suggesting not innocence but uncertainty, leaning on the passage of time as a weapon, arguing that memories fade, evidence degrades, narratives evolve, planting the idea that after 34 years, truth itself may be too compromised to trust. Prosecutors counter with consistency, showing how facts remain stable even as years passed, how the science speaks where witnesses cannot, how the suspect's DNA was present where it should never have been, and this contrast between human fallibility and genetic permanence becomes the emotional core of the case. As jury selection begins, potential jurors are asked uncomfortable questions about trust in science, about patience, about whether justice delayed is justice denied, and each answer shapes the fate of a story that has already outlived one generation and now threatens to define another. When the trial finally begins, the courtroom fills not with drama, but with anticipation, the quiet before a storm built from decades of silence. And as the first witness takes the stand, the cold case officially steps into the present, no longer an echo, no longer a mystery whispered in corners, but a living confrontation between what happened and what can finally be proven. Yet even now, with evidence laid out and arguments sharpened, something remains elusive, a sense that understanding a crime is not the same as understanding the moment that created it, that even when a killer is identified, the why may remain just out of reach. And as the trial unfolds day by day, the community watches, torn between relief that the waiting is over and the unsettling realization that some questions, once asked, never truly find answers. The case is no longer cold. But the chill has not lifted. The trial moves forward in measured steps, each day adding weight to a story that already feels unbearably heavy. And as testimony unfolds, the courtroom becomes a place where two timelines collide, 1989 bleeding into the present, the past refusing to stay buried despite decades of distance. The prosecution begins with the basics, grounding the jury in the night everything changed, establishing the setting, the routine, the expectations that were shattered without warning, and as they speak, the victim is no longer an abstract name in a file, but a presence reconstructed through words, habits, relationships, plans that ended abruptly, reminding everyone that before there was evidence, there was a life. Photographs from the crime scene are introduced carefully, warnings issued, screens adjusted, because even after all these years, the images carry a visceral force, a frozen violence that transcends resolution and logic, and jurors shift in their seats as they absorb details that no amount of time can soften. Then comes the science. Experts take the stand, voices calm, precise, explaining processes step by step, how biological material was collected, preserved, retested, how DNA profiles are built from fragments, how probabilities collapse into near certainty, and as charts appear and terminology fills the air, the case pivots away from emotion toward inevitability. The defense presses hard here, cross-examining every procedure, every gap in documentation, every moment when human judgment intersected with technology, suggesting that the passage of time introduces risks no protocol can fully eliminate, and for a moment the room feels balanced on a knife edge between trust and doubt. But the experts do not waver. They explain redundancy, independent verification, controls, safeguards. They speak of statistical odds so astronomical that coincidence becomes a fantasy, and slowly, the scientific narrative settles into place, not as spectacle, but as foundation, solid and immovable. Witnesses from the past follow, neighbors, acquaintances, people who knew the victim and the suspect in passing, their testimony colored by memory's imperfections, yet threaded together by consistency, placing the suspect in proximity, establishing access, painting a picture of opportunity that grows clearer with each voice. Some witnesses struggle. Names slip. Dates blur. Emotion interrupts recollection. And yet, in these imperfections, the jury sees something real, the human cost of time, the way trauma embeds itself unevenly, refusing to be neatly archived. The defense capitalizes on every uncertainty, highlighting contradictions, questioning reliability, reminding jurors that doubt, however small, must weigh heavily when a man's freedom hangs in the balance, and this tension, between compassion for the accused and responsibility to the truth, becomes palpable. Behind the scenes, the victim's family endures each day with quiet endurance, absorbing details they never wanted to know, watching a stranger speak about someone they loved in clinical terms, and even as justice inches closer, grief feels freshly sharpened. They sit through expert testimony. They listen to legal arguments. They hear their loved ones' final moments reconstructed by people who were not there. And they endure. As the trial progresses, the suspect's demeanor becomes a subject of silent observation. His posture, his expressions, moments of apparent detachment or fatigue scrutinized by eyes searching for meaning, though everyone knows appearances are unreliable, that guilt and innocence do not announce themselves clearly. Still, the atmosphere thickens. Because each piece of evidence added feels like another door closing, another escape route disappearing, and the defense senses it too, adjusting strategy, leaning harder on the abstract, on philosophy, on the idea that justice delayed might be justice distorted. Closing arguments approach. Both sides begin to sharpen their narratives, preparing to distill weeks of testimony into a story simple enough to remember, powerful enough to persuade, and the courtroom seems to hold its breath, aware that whatever comes next will echo far beyond these walls. When the prosecution finally rests, the silence that follows is profound, a pause heavy with implication, because what has been laid out cannot be unseen, cannot be unheard, and even those who entered skeptical feel the gravity of what has been presented. The defense responds, calling its own witnesses, emphasizing restraint, caution, the danger of hindsight, urging the jury to consider not just what is known, but what is unknowable after so many years, and this appeal, grounded in fear of error, resonates in a system built to avoid irreversible mistakes. Yet beneath the legal dance, an unspoken truth hums steadily, that this case has already crossed a threshold, that regardless of verdict, the mystery that once defined it has been replaced by confrontation, and there is no return to not knowing. As the final witnesses step down and arguments draw to a close, the courtroom feels changed, as if the air itself has absorbed decades of waiting, and when the judge addresses the jury, reminding them of their duty, their power, the responsibility they carry, the weight of those words presses against every chest in the room. Deliberations loom. And with them, the promise of an ending that has been deferred for 34 years. But endings, everyone knows, are rarely clean. And whatever the verdict, the shadows of that night in 1989 will not simply disappear. They will linger, reshaped but not erased, woven permanently into the memory of a community that has learned too late how long the past can survive. The jury disappears behind a closed door, and the courtroom becomes a waiting room for fate, a place where every sound feels amplified, where coughs seem too loud, where the scrape of a chair against tile can make heads turn as if it might be the first sign of an answer, and outside, the world keeps moving, cars passing, phones ringing, calendars flipping, indifferent to the fact that inside this building, 34 years of uncertainty has been condensed into 12 strangers weighing silence against science. The victim's family sits together, shoulders tight, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once, because waiting is not new to them. They have been waiting since 1989, waiting through birthdays, funerals, anniversaries, waiting through the dull ache of acceptance that sometimes masquerades as peace. But this wait is different. This wait has a deadline. This wait ends with a word, guilty or not guilty. And either word will change the shape of their grief. Across the aisle, the defendant's family holds their own breath, because they are waiting too, not for closure, but for collapse, for confirmation that the man they knew was never the man they believed, or for a miracle that will spare them from a truth they can already feel creeping closer. And in that shared tension, the courtroom becomes a strange mirror, two families staring at the same nightmare from opposite ends. Hours pass. Then more. The judge steps out, then returns. Lawyers whisper, shuffle papers, stare at phones that won't ring. A bailiff stands like a statue, the human embodiment of order in a room drowning in emotion. And somewhere behind that closed door, voices rise and fall, jurors arguing over definitions, over doubt, over what beyond a reasonable doubt feels like when the crime is older than some of the people deciding its outcome, over whether science can carry the full burden of truth, over whether time itself should grant mercy, over whether mercy is even relevant when a life was taken without it. Late in the day, a note arrives. The bailiff hands it to the judge. The judge reads it silently, expression controlled, then looks up and addresses the room with a calm that feels almost artificial in the face of what everyone is feeling, explaining that the jury has a question, a clarification request, and suddenly all the tension becomes active again. Not waiting now but listening, because a question means struggle, it means uncertainty, it means the verdict is not a straight line. The attorneys approach the bench, voices low. Procedures. Definitions. An answer is crafted carefully because every word matters, because the wrong phrasing can tip a decision, and after a brief exchange, the judge responds, and the jury returns to deliberations with the weight of that guidance pressing down on them. Night falls. The courthouse lights glow against the dark, sterile, and unforgiving, and for the first time, the victim's family feels something they haven't felt in decades, the sensation that time is finally narrowing toward a point, that the endless hallway of not knowing is ending in a door they are about to walk through whether they are ready or not. The next morning, the courtroom fills early. Reporters settle in. Spectators whisper. And when the jury files back in, their faces are unreadable, the kind of controlled neutrality that can hide anything: relief, certainty, doubt, exhaustion. And the defendant stands as well, hands at his sides, older shoulders squared, not heroic, not defiant, just bracing, like someone standing under a collapsing roof hoping the beams fall in a predictable way. The clerk asks the question, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson answers, "Yes." There's a pause, a space of time so small it should be meaningless, yet it feels enormous, a suspended breath shared by everyone in the room, and then the verdict is read. Guilty. A word that lands like a physical object, heavy, final, impossible to misunderstand. The victim's family reacts first not with celebration but with release, faces collapsing, hands covering mouths, eyes closing, because guilt does not bring back what was taken. It only ends the question that gnawed at them for 34 years, And even that ending is sharp, painful, because it forces them to accept that all those years of waiting were years the killer spent free. Across the room, the defendant's family breaks in a different way: quiet shock, disbelief, tears that feel like betrayal, because even if they suspected, even if they prepared, hearing it spoken aloud is a different kind of devastation. A public declaration that their life story has been rewritten without their consent. The defendant himself barely moves. A small blink. A slight tightening of the mouth. But nothing dramatic. No outburst. No collapse. Just a stillness that reads like surrender or calculation, depending on who is watching, and that ambiguity, even at the moment of verdict, keeps the air uneasy. The judge sets the date for sentencing. More waiting. More procedures. More time. And yet, the case is no longer drifting in uncertainty. It is anchored now, pinned down by legal reality, and that changes everything because now the story has an ending the law recognizes, even if the human heart doesn't. In the weeks before sentencing, impact statements are prepared, drafts written and rewritten, because how do you compress 34 years of loss into words that fit inside a courtroom? How do you explain the way a single night can infect every year that follows? How do you speak to the person who did it and not let your voice shake with rage or grief? Investigators, too, feel the strange aftershock of victory, because solving a cold case is not like solving a fresh one. There is no immediate celebration, no adrenaline rush that fades into relief. Instead, there's a quiet reckoning, a recognition of everything that was missed, everything that might have happened sooner, everything that cannot be undone even though the truth is finally known. They revisit the evidence logs again, not because they need to, but because they can't stop, because cold cases teach you to distrust closure, to check and recheck, to make sure the truth is solid enough to hold the weight now being placed on it. And as they look through those old forms, those faded signatures, they think about the people who started this work and never saw it finished. At sentencing, the courtroom feels different, not tense with uncertainty now but heavy with consequence. And when the victim's family stands to speak, the room becomes a conduit for pain that has been stored too long, words spilling out in controlled bursts, describing birthdays without laughter, holidays with an empty seat, the fear that lingered in every locked door, the way the community carried the story like a scar. They speak of the victim as a person, not an exhibit, not a photograph, not a name in a headline, but a presence, a laugh, a habit, a future that should have existed. And as they speak, the defendant sits and listens, face unreadable, because remorse, if it exists, is not always visible, and sometimes what hurts most is the absence of visible emotion. The sense that the crime was a moment to the killer but a lifetime to everyone else. The prosecution asks for a sentence that reflects not just the act, but the decades of avoidance, the years the defendant lived free while the family lived trapped, arguing that time should not soften accountability, that age does not erase harm. The defense argues for mitigation, pointing to the defendant's age, his health, his lack of recent criminal behavior, suggesting that the man before the court is not the same man who walked into that house in 1989, implying that punishment now is more symbolic than practical. But symbolism is not nothing. Symbolism is the difference between forgetting and remembering. The judge listens, expression still, eyes moving between faces, absorbing the weight that no robe can truly shield. And when the sentence is delivered, it is not theatrical, it is formal, a set of years, a legal structure meant to contain something that cannot truly be contained. As the gavel falls, the room exhales, not in relief, not fully, but in acknowledgement that this chapter is closing, that the case has reached the point that seemed impossible for so long. Outside, cameras capture the family leaving the courthouse, faces wet with tears, voices trembling in interviews, saying words like finally and justice and closure. But even as they speak, their eyes reveal the truth that every cold case carries, that closure is not a door you walk through and leave pain behind. It is a different kind of room you learn to live in. A space where questions have names and the unknown has finally been forced into the light. And yet, as night settles again over California, as streetlights hum and porch lights click on, there is still an unease that refuses to fade, because solving the case does not change what happened in that quiet house, it does not erase the moment a life ended without warning, and it does not answer the darkest question of all, not who did it, not how, but what happened inside the killer's mind that night. The unseen spark that turned ordinary into monstrous. The law has spoken. The science has spoken. The headlines declare the cold case solved. But in the places where grief lives, in the corners of memory, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, the past still whispers, and the community still feels it. The lingering chill of a night in 1989 that took far more than one life, leaving behind a shadow that even truth cannot fully chase away. Even after sentencing, even after the microphones have been packed away and the courthouse doors have closed, the story does not stop, because a cold case does not end the way people imagine endings, with a clean cut and a quiet fade-out. It ends like a wound being stitched after years of infection, sealed on the surface but still tender underneath, still pulsing when touched. And in the weeks that follow, the community begins to learn what solved actually means. There are the practical ripples first, the ones that don't make headlines but change people's behavior in ways they barely notice. Neighbors double-checking locks, glancing twice at unfamiliar cars, pausing a little longer at the mailbox to scan the street, because the most unsettling part is not that a killer existed, it's that he existed in plain sight. The familiar face in the grocery aisle, the polite nod at a stop sign, the ordinary presence that turns out to have carried something predatory all along. People begin revisiting old memories with a new kind of violence, replaying conversations, searching for moments that now feel like warnings, asking themselves whether there were signs, whether the suspect ever said something off, whether his smile ever seemed too fixed, whether the calm was ever too calm. And this is how communities try to defend themselves after the illusion breaks, by convincing themselves they could have known. Because admitting you couldn't is too terrifying. The victim's family returns to routines they haven't practiced in decades, routines that were delayed, not denied, and there's something surreal about that. Grief finally being allowed to evolve into something else, not happiness, not peace, but a quieter kind of endurance. And yet even this shift is complicated, because justice arrived late, and late justice carries its own bitterness. They sort through old boxes again, letters, photos, keepsakes, the small artifacts they kept because they were all they had, and now each item feels different, because the story that framed them has changed, the villain no longer a faceless shadow, but a named person, a body in a cell, and that clarity doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like a new kind of rage at the years stolen, rage at the normal life the suspect got to live while their own lives were frozen in survival mode. Then come the questions from outsiders, questions asked with curiosity that can feel like intrusion, people wanting to know details, wanting to understand how it happened, wanting to turn tragedy into narrative, and the family learns quickly that even when a case is solved, it still belongs to the public in a way that feels unfair, because grief is personal but headlines are not, and every time someone says, "I can't believe it took 34 years," the family hears the subtext, the unspoken math of time, the years the victim never got. Investigators feel it too, that strange mixed aftertaste of victory and regret, because solving a case is supposed to feel like triumph, but cold cases rarely deliver triumph, they deliver reckoning, and as detectives look back on the original investigation, they see the limitations, the missed angles, the lack of tools, and they ask themselves the same question that haunts every cold case unit: how many other names are sitting in boxes right now, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for a lab budget, waiting for a single decision to retest something that could change everything. The department begins fielding calls not about this case but about other cases, because whenever one cold case is solved, hope floods the system like electricity, families of other victims calling, emailing, begging for the same miracle, asking if there's DNA, if there's a sample, if there's a chance, and detectives have to navigate that hope carefully because hope is powerful, but it can also be cruel when it has nowhere to land. Behind the scenes, prosecutors prepare for the next phase everyone knows is coming, the appeal, because verdicts do not end battles, they begin new ones, and in the months following conviction, the defense files motions, challenges, arguments built around technicalities and procedure, because when facts are suffocating, the law becomes the battlefield, and the suspect's legal team does what legal teams are meant to do. They search for cracks. Chain of custody is questioned again, old paperwork pulled into the present like a ghost, storage conditions examined, lab methods scrutinized, and these arguments unfold in sterile language that feels almost insulting to the emotional weight of the case. But that sterility is intentional, because the law does not run on grief, it runs on rules, and rules are the only thing standing between justice and chaos. For the victim's family, the appeal feels like being forced back into the storm after finally reaching shore, because they had allowed themselves a breath, a moment of "it's over." And now they must endure the story again, listen again, worry again, because the justice system demands patience even after patience has been spent. The suspect's name stays in the news, resurfacing periodically when a hearing is scheduled, When a motion is filed, when a decision is issued, and each time the community reacts with a jolt, because the case has become part of their collective identity now, the crime that taught them how vulnerable normal life really is. Journalists dig deeper, revisiting the original year, interviewing retired detectives, scanning archived newspapers, trying to reconstruct the early investigation, and with every article comes the same eerie theme: how close the truth might have been and yet how unreachable it remained, because without the power of DNA, suspicion is just suspicion. And the 80s were filled with cases that turned into cold files simply because the era's tools were blunt. And this is where the story takes on a second life, a wider meaning beyond one community, because this case becomes another example in a growing list of modern breakthroughs. Proof that evidence can speak long after witnesses go silent, proof that time is not always the killer of truth. Sometimes time is just the distance science needs to travel before it can reach the past. But even as the narrative becomes inspirational to outsiders, to true crime audiences, to people who love the idea of justice delayed but delivered, the emotional reality remains darker and more complicated. Because the family does not get to experience this as a story, they experience it as a scar being reopened for public consumption, and every time a stranger calls it fascinating, something inside them tightens. Then there's the question no verdict answers, the why, and the absence of motive continues to gnaw, because identifying a killer is not the same as understanding him, and human beings are wired to seek meaning in violence, to find a reason that makes it feel less random, less terrifying, and when no clear motive emerges, the crime feels even more disturbing, because it suggests the possibility of impulse, of opportunity, of a predator acting not out of rage or desperation but out of something colder, something that does not fit neatly into narrative. Investigators chase motive anyway, combing through the suspect's past for fractures, hidden obsessions, patterns, anything that might explain what happened, and they find the ordinary things: jobs, moves, relationships, minor troubles, nothing that screams monster. And that becomes its own horror, the reminder that monsters do not always announce themselves, that sometimes they blend perfectly into the background until the moment they don't. In quiet conversations, detectives admit something most people don't want to hear: that some crimes are not committed because of a single dramatic reason, but because of a moment, a choice, a boundary crossed, and once crossed, it can never be uncrossed, and the person who crossed it will spend the rest of their life building walls around that moment, walls made of routine, charm, distance, and time. The suspect sits in prison now, older, slower, a body confined, and yet his presence still reaches outward, because even behind bars he has power, the power to keep secrets, to withhold explanations, to let the family imagine 1,000 versions of the night, each one a different kind of torture. And the law cannot force motive out of a person, it can only punish action. As the appeal process grinds forward, as legal language battles over science and procedure, the family is left with something like closure but not quite, a resolution that comes with footnotes, and those footnotes matter because a case can be solved in headlines while still feeling unsettled in the heart. And in the community, the night in 1989 becomes a reference point again, not just as tragedy but as warning, a reminder that time can hide things, that certainty is fragile, that evil can move quietly through ordinary spaces, and this realization changes the way people tell stories to their children, changes the way they look at neighbors, changes the way they interpret silence. Because silence after a case like this is never just silence. It is what the victim heard before everything ended. It is what the killer relied on for decades. It is what the community lived in, unknowingly, while truth waited in a sealed evidence bag, patient and untouched. And even now, even with a verdict and a sentence, the silence still carries an echo, not of mystery anymore, but of consequence, the lingering chill of knowing that the past can survive in the present, that justice can arrive late, and that some questions, the ones that matter most to the human mind, may never be answered at all, leaving behind not a neat ending, but a shadow that stretches long beyond the final headline. The appeal does not arrive like a storm, it arrives like paperwork, thick and dry and relentless, and yet every page feels like a hand reaching back into the family's chest to squeeze, because the legal system has a cruel talent for turning the most emotional events into technical arguments, and in those arguments the crime becomes numbers, dates, procedural steps, not a life ended, not a family shattered, just a case to be contested. Headlines flare again, cold case in bold, DNA in caps, appeal filed, defense challenges evidence, and the community feels the familiar jolt, that reflexive tightening in the stomach, because they thought the story had ended, they thought the gavel meant silence, But cold cases do not end cleanly. They keep breathing through motions and hearings and the slow machinery of review, and each time the case resurfaces, the past rises with it, uninvited. In legal briefs, the defense circles the same points like vultures over a scar, chain of custody, the handling of evidence across decades, the conditions of storage, the reliability of newer lab methods applied to older samples, and prosecutors respond with their own language, controlled, firm, explaining redundancy, documentation, the improbability of contamination, surviving checks, the safeguards built into modern testing, the way science does not depend on memory or mood, only on molecules that do not care who is watching. But to the family, it doesn't matter how rational the arguments sound because the emotional truth is simple. They have already lived through the worst possible version of waiting, and now they are being asked to wait again, to tolerate uncertainty again, to accept that even when the truth finally comes, it can be forced back into question by a legal system designed to protect the accused from error, even if that protection feels like punishment to the living. They begin to dread the calendar not because of holidays anymore, but because of court dates, the way a scheduled hearing can poison an entire month, the way a single letter from a prosecutor can make hands shake, the way the phrase continuance granted can feel like a door slamming in slow motion. Investigators, too, feel the pull of unfinished business, because the appeal forces them to reopen boxes they had finally allowed themselves to close, to revisit old logs, to locate the retired technician who signed a form in the early 90s, to track down lab notes that were filed under systems long replaced. And this is when the case reveals its second nightmare, not the crime itself, but the fragility of record-keeping across eras. How a smudged signature or a missing date can become a weapon in the hands of someone trying to loosen the grip of accountability. The detectives speak with people who were young officers in 1989 and are now gray-haired, voices quieter, eyes tired, and the older ones carry something like guilt, not for failing, but for existing in an era that couldn't do what today can do, because they know the family's pain stretched for decades partly because technology had not yet evolved into its current power, and that realization is both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because it offers explanation, infuriating because explanation is not justice. Around the same time, the true crime machine turns the case into a product. Podcasts revisit the story with dramatic music, YouTube thumbnails flash the words "solved" in bright letters, and strangers begin debating motive online as if it's a game, as if someone's death is just content, and the family encounters their grief repackaged into entertainment, voice actors reenacting moments they never witnessed, influencers reading lines from the case file with performative suspense, and the family feels that sick twist of being both grateful the story is remembered and horrified by the way it's consumed. The community divides quietly, not over guilt but over meaning, some people clinging to the narrative of justice, the triumph of science, the idea that society is safer now, and others fixated on the terror, the thought that the suspect lived among them for decades without consequence, the thought that the same could be true right now, somewhere else, in another neighborhood that still believes it's immune. For some, the solved case becomes a warning sign that changes behavior permanently, parents become stricter, neighbors become suspicious, trust becomes thinner. Because once a community learns that the face of danger can look familiar, it never returns fully to innocence. And then, unexpectedly, another ripple begins, not in the courtroom, but in the cold case unit itself, because this conviction becomes a catalyst. Evidence technicians start pulling other long-dormant samples, supervisors push for funding, lawmakers cite the case in meetings, and suddenly the solved murder becomes a lever that shifts resources, that changes priorities, that forces institutions to look back at other forgotten files and ask, what else is sitting on a shelf waiting for the same kind of breakthrough? Families of other victims hear the news and feel that electric surge of possibility. They call, they write, they show up at stations holding photos that have faded at the corners from being held too often, saying the same desperate sentence in different words. If you solved that one, can you solve ours? Detectives listen, and their faces reveal what they cannot say out loud, that not every case has preserved DNA, not every case has clean evidence, not every case will be rescued by technology, because science is powerful but not magical, and hope, when unleashed, can wound as much as it heals. Still, the department begins reprocessing evidence, rerunning profiles through databases that expand every year, and quietly behind the scenes the solved case becomes part of a larger movement, a shift in how society treats the past, less as something fixed and unreachable and more as something that can be excavated and answered if you have the right tools. But there is another uncomfortable layer, one that surfaces in quiet debates among experts, the ethics of genetic genealogy, because it was not a direct match that led to the suspect at first, it was a family thread, a bloodline pulled from a database and traced through people who never consented to be part of a murder investigation. And while the public cheers the result, the questions remain sharp. How much privacy is society willing to trade for justice? How many innocent relatives will be dragged into the orbit of suspicion because of DNA they share but crimes they never committed? These debates stay mostly in professional circles, but they matter because cases like this one prove the power of the method and also reveal its shadow, the way the pursuit of truth can brush against the boundaries of personal freedom. And in the tension between these forces, you feel the future of justice being negotiated in real time. Meanwhile, the suspect remains mostly silent, lawyers speaking for him, statements limited, and that silence becomes a kind of weapon, because it denies the family the one thing they still crave beyond the verdict: explanation. They want to know what happened in the minutes before the act, what was said, whether the victim recognized danger, whether fear arrived suddenly or slowly, whether it ended quickly or stretched. They want a map of those final moments, not because it will help them sleep, but because not knowing is a prison of its own. Sometimes letters arrive not from the suspect but from strangers, people moved by the story, people who say they pray for the family, people who claim they knew something back then but didn't speak up, confessions of guilt that are not criminal but moral, neighbors writing to say I should have noticed. And the family reads these letters with a strange detachment because kindness, while welcome, cannot reverse anything, and regret, while sincere, does not change the math of years. At a community vigil held quietly away from cameras, someone speaks the victim's name aloud in a way that feels different now, no longer framed by uncertainty, but by confirmation, and candles flicker in the dark like small stubborn defiance against the long stretch of night the case created. And for a moment the community feels something close to unity, not celebration, not relief but recognition, the acknowledgement that this tragedy shaped them and will continue to shape them long after the media moves on again. The appeal process continues, and each ruling arrives like a measured heartbeat: motion denied, argument rejected. One by one the defense attempts to loosen the conviction, and prosecutors respond with steady pressure, because the science is strong, the documentation holds, and yet nobody dares to assume, because assumption is how people get blindsided, and cold cases teach you never to trust the ground completely. In prison, the suspect ages under fluorescent lights, his world reduced to schedules and walls and time. The thing that protected him for decades becomes his new cage. And this irony is not comforting, it is simply bitter, because the family knows that even if he dies behind bars, even if the system holds, nothing can return what was stolen. Still, the fear shifts now from will we ever know to will they try to undo it, because a solved case can be reopened by legal mechanisms, and the family lives with that possibility like a low-grade fever, always present, always draining. And the community feels it too, because the idea of the suspect walking free again, even hypothetically, is enough to make people's throats tighten. And then one afternoon a rumor spreads, not confirmed, not denied at first, a whisper that the suspect might speak, might offer a statement, might finally answer the question he has guarded for decades, and the family's hearts lurch, because the most terrifying thing about silence is the hope that it might break, and the most terrifying thing about hope is how easily it can be crushed. Phones light up. Voicemails stack. Lawyers make calls. Detectives exchange looks. And the story, even now, even after everything, proves it still has power, the power to drag the present back into the past with a single possibility, because this is what a cold case does even when solved. It keeps its grip, it keeps its shadows, it keeps its ability to turn ordinary days into something that feels like the edge of a cliff, where one sentence, one confession, one refusal, can change the entire weight of what everyone thought they understood. The rumor doesn't come with a siren or an official press release, it comes the way most truths begin to surface in old cases, sideways through a crack, a whisper that slides under doors and multiplies in hallways, one phone call turning into 10-1, I heard he might talk, becoming a pulse that runs through the victim's family like electricity, and through the police department like an alarm no one can quite silence. Detectives hear it first from the place they always hear these things, the margins of the system, a lawyer's assistant mentioning something offhand, a correctional officer saying the defendant has been asking unusual questions, a probation clerk noticing a request for contact that doesn't fit the pattern, and suddenly every person who has lived inside this case for decades stiffens, because after 34 years of silence, the idea of words feels dangerous. They know the calculus. If he talks, it could bring motive. If he talks, it could bring details only the killer would know. If he talks, it could cement the conviction beyond any appeal. But if he talks, it could also bring manipulation, a last attempt to control the story, to negotiate, to trade truth for comfort, to weaponize closure the way he once weaponized time. So the detectives move carefully, the way you approach a door you suspect is booby-trapped. No sudden movements, no loud promises, because the suspect has already demonstrated the one skill that matters most in long-evaded guilt: patience. A meeting is arranged in a prison visiting room that smells faintly of disinfectant and stale air. A room designed to strip everyone down to their most basic selves. No distractions, no power, just a table, chairs bolted to the floor, and the steady presence of cameras watching without emotion. When he enters, he looks older than he did at trial, as if the verdict aged him faster than the decades did. Shoulders slightly hunched now, hair thinner, face drawn, the kind of quiet deterioration that prison accelerates. And yet there's something else too, a steadiness in his eyes that makes detectives uneasy, because he doesn't look like a man desperate to confess. He looks like a man calculating what confession might buy. They don't begin with questions. They begin with space. Silence is offered like bait. They let him feel the emptiness, because some people fill silence with truth simply because they can't stand it. He sits. He folds his hands. He looks at the detectives the way someone looks at a photograph they don't like but can't stop examining. And then finally he speaks. Not the words they want, not a confession but a request. He wants to know what happens next. He wants to know how long appeals can take. He wants to know whether he will die in prison. And this is the first truth of the day, the truth beneath everything else. He is afraid. Not of guilt. Not of shame. Of time. Time was his shield for 34 years, and now time is closing around him like a fist, and he wants to bargain with the only currency he has left. Detectives listen, faces neutral, because they've seen this before. The late-life bargaining of men who held secrets like trophies and now find those trophies worthless behind bars, and when they ask him why he reached out, he doesn't answer directly. He says he's tired. He says he's been thinking. He says there are things people don't understand. And the phrase lands in the air like a match near gasoline, because things people don't understand is not innocence, it's narrative. It's an attempt to reframe the past, to make himself more complex than a headline. They press gently, asking what exactly people don't understand. He pauses. He looks at the table. His jaw tightens the way it did in interrogation, that same micro-expression that once signaled the first crack in the wall, and then he says something that makes the room feel colder. He says he didn't plan it. Not a denial. Not a confession. A pivot. The kind of statement designed to shift the moral weight from predator to accident, from intention to tragedy, and detectives recognize it instantly as the oldest trick in the book. The "it just happened" defense, the attempt to make murder sound like weather. They ask what he means. He says he knew the victim but not the way people think. He says there was a moment, a misunderstanding, a situation that escalated. He says he panicked. The words are vague, clouded, lacking detail, and that vagueness is its own warning, because people telling the truth usually spill specifics without meaning to, while people crafting a story keep it blurred until they know what the story will cost. Detectives push for specifics anyway. Where were you standing? What did you say? What did the victim say? How did you get inside? How did you leave? And with each question, the suspect becomes more guarded. Less tired-looking now, more aware. Like a man realizing the silence he lived in for decades is still his strongest weapon. Outside the prison walls, the rumor spreads faster than the facts, because rumors always do, and within days, media outlets begin calling the department, asking if the suspect is cooperating, if a confession is coming, if new details will be released, and detectives refuse to confirm, refusing to feed the machine, but silence in the modern world is interpreted as confirmation anyway, and the public appetite sharpens. For the victim's family, the rumor is torture disguised as hope, because hope can be cruel when it comes with conditions, and they find themselves in an emotional trap, wanting the truth but fearing what the truth will feel like because details can be knives, and if the suspect speaks, he might do it in a way that wounds them all over again. They are offered the possibility of hearing a statement through prosecutors, the chance to be informed, maybe even to ask questions through intermediaries, and the family debates it late into the night, voices low, torn between the desire to know and the desire to protect what little emotional stability they've managed to build after the verdict. Some of them want everything. Every detail. every second, because knowledge feels like control, and control was stolen from them in 1989. Others can't bear it, because they have spent decades imagining the worst, and hearing the worst spoken aloud could turn imagination into permanent reality. Inside the courthouse system, prosecutors discuss strategy, because a confession can be a gift and a trap, and they know the defendant's legal team is watching too, because if the suspect speaks inconsistently, it could become ammunition for appeal, and if he speaks strategically, it could become a plea for leniency disguised as remorse. In quiet offices, prosecutors and detectives weigh the ethics of negotiation, because the suspect wants something, and giving him anything feels like a betrayal, yet refusing to engage might mean losing the only chance to secure motive, to confirm details that could protect the conviction forever. The suspect's attorney contacts the prosecution with cautious language, floating the possibility of a statement, and in that exchange the power dynamic becomes painfully clear, because even now, even behind bars, the suspect holds a lever, the lever of information, and he knows exactly how hard the family wants that lever pulled. But time has changed the world, and prosecutors know that statements can backfire. That a man who has lived inside a secret for decades may not speak with clarity or honesty when it finally emerges. And they also know that the law does not require motive when DNA has already spoken. So they resist bargaining. They listen. They wait. And waiting again becomes the central theme of the case, because waiting is what this story has always demanded from everyone except the person who caused it. Days pass. Then weeks. The initial rumor cools, then flares again when a prison chaplain mentions the defendant has asked for spiritual counsel, and that detail hits the community like a shock, because people interpret spiritual counsel as confession in disguise, as the prelude to remorse, as the softening of a heart that has been sealed for decades. Detectives request another meeting. This time the suspect speaks less. He asks more. He wants to know if the family hates him. He wants to know what the media is saying. He wants to know if anyone remembers him from back then. It's as if he's trying to measure his own mythology, trying to see whether he is a monster in the public mind or merely a man who made a mistake, and that craving to control how he is seen reveals something motive never did. He's not just afraid of prison. He's afraid of narrative. Detectives ask him again for specifics, and finally, for the first time, he offers a sliver that feels real. He describes the house. Not in general terms, but in a way that suggests memory, a particular angle of a hallway, the location of a lamp, a small detail that was never public, something that makes the detectives glance at each other because it aligns with photographs from 1989 that few people have seen. The room tightens. Because this is what truth feels like. Not grand, not cinematic, but precise. They ask him how he knows that. He doesn't answer. He stares at the table again. And in that silence the family's world shifts because the possibility hardens into something close to confirmation, that yes, he was there, yes, he remembers, yes, he carried the scene in his mind all these years. When the meeting ends, he leaves without offering the confession everyone wanted, and detectives are left with fragments, pieces that can strengthen the case but not satisfy the hunger for explanation, and the family receives a carefully worded update from the prosecution, nothing graphic, nothing explicit, but enough to make their skin prickle with dread. They learn there may never be a full confession. Because confession is not justice. Confession is a gift. And this man does not give gifts without payment. The appeal continues in the background like a slow-moving threat, and in one ruling after another, courts uphold the conviction, rejecting claims of mishandling, affirming the reliability of testing, and with each denial, the legal ground beneath the verdict becomes firmer, but emotional ground remains unstable, because the family realizes something painful. The system can secure a conviction, but it cannot secure answers. The suspect may die with the why locked inside him, and that possibility lands like a second crime. In the months that follow, the media moves on again because media always does, new cases, new headlines, new horror, and yet in the community the story remains alive, carried in the way people glance at each other when the case is mentioned, carried in the way parents talk about safety, carried in the way silence now feels ominous instead of neutral. And somewhere in prison an aging man sits under fluorescent light, still holding the one thing he has left, the only control remaining, the story behind the story, the motive behind the act, the invisible trigger that turned a night in 1989 into a nightmare that stretched across 34 years. The case is solved in the eyes of the law. But the human mind is not built to accept verdicts without understanding. So the community lives with a strange kind of ending, the killer identified, convicted, caged, and yet the center of the darkness still partly unlit, a shadow that keeps its shape even under harsh light, leaving everyone with the same uneasy realization. Sometimes the most terrifying part of a cold case isn't that it was unsolved for so long. It's that even when it's solved, it can still refuse to give you peace. The months after the last major appeal ruling don't feel like victory. They feel like a slow uncoiling, as if a rope that has been pulled tight for 34 years is finally being allowed to loosen one thread at a time. And even that loosening hurts, because tension becomes familiar, because waiting becomes a way of life, because when a cold case lives inside you long enough, resolution can feel like an unfamiliar room you don't know how to stand in without bracing for impact. The court's language is blunt, clinical, final, arguments rejected, conviction upheld, DNA evidence deemed reliable, procedure deemed sound. And on paper that's the end of the fight. The law has spoken and then spoken again, reinforcing itself like a locked door. But in the family's world, in the community's world, endings don't arrive with stamps and signatures. They arrive in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the mind wanders back to 1989 and tries to make the math of time feel fair, and it never can. There are days when the family feels almost lighter, almost because at least the name is known, at least the face is real, at least the killer isn't a ghost anymore. And then there are days when anger hits like a sudden wave, because knowing the name also means knowing that he walked free for decades, that he watched the world change, that he aged in sunlight while they aged in grief. And the unfairness of that reality is not something a verdict can correct. They start noticing the small betrayals of ordinary life again, the way a stranger's laugh can resemble the victim's laugh, the way a song from the late 80s can crack the spine of memory, the way an old photograph can suddenly feel too vivid, and sometimes they catch themselves imagining the simplest impossible thing. What if the victim had lived? What would their hair look like now? What would their voice sound like at this age? What would their laugh have become? And that imagining is its own kind of punishment, because it paints a life that was stolen so completely the world forgot the outline. In the community, the case becomes a permanent reference point, not because people want it to be, but because the solved cold case rearranged their sense of safety, and once rearranged, it never returns to its original shape. People bring it up at barbecues, at neighborhood meetings, in half-joking remarks about locking doors, but beneath the jokes is something sharper. A recognition that danger doesn't always arrive with warning lights. Sometimes it arrives with familiarity. Detectives who work the reinvestigation feel something like closure, but it's not celebration, it's fatigue, the kind that comes from living inside someone else's darkness for too long, and they begin to look at the case not as an isolated miracle, but as a template, because the truth is brutal and simple. If this one was solvable all along, others might be too. If evidence can speak after 34 years, then every dusty box on every shelf is potentially a voice waiting to be heard. The department quietly shifts. Funding requests become easier to justify. Lab backlogs become talking points. Policies about evidence retention and digitizing old records get renewed urgency. They hold internal meetings where supervisors point to this case and say, this is why we preserve, this is why we catalog, this is why we never throw away a maybe. Because maybe becomes a name, maybe becomes a handcuff click, maybe becomes a family finally hearing the words they've waited for. And then comes the second shadow of a solved case. Re-examination. Because once you identify a person capable of this kind of violence, you can't help but wonder what else they did, whether the 1989 murder was an isolated eruption or one point on a hidden timeline. And detectives begin combing through other unsolved cases from that era. Not publicly, not loudly, but methodically, looking for overlaps, geography, methods, time windows, anything that suggests a pattern. Old maps appear on desks. Pinpoints. Notes. Dates. Reports from other counties, other states. Investigators talk to agencies that once had no reason to collaborate on a file this old, and the conversations are cautious because linking cases is dangerous, because it can create false hope, because nothing is worse than telling a family we think we have your killer and then having to take it back. But the question refuses to vanish. Because killers rarely announce themselves once. Because secrets kept for 34 years are rarely the only secret. They check the suspect's movements across decades, employment records, relocations, gaps where he disappeared from paper trails. And those gaps feel like dark water, not proof, not even evidence, just absence, the kind of absence that makes investigators lean in closer. They request additional DNA comparison where possible, and here the cold reality hits. Many old cases don't have preserved biological evidence. Many samples are degraded. Many scenes were processed with the limitations of their time, and suddenly the case becomes a mirror reflecting not just one solved tragedy, but a whole era of unsolved ones left behind by technology's slow evolution. The victim's family hears whispers of these efforts and feels a conflict they can't easily name, a desire to make meaning out of their pain by helping others, and at the same time a fear of being pulled back into the spotlight again, because if the suspect is linked to other crimes, the media will return like vultures, the story will expand, the case will become bigger. And bigger cases don't feel bigger to the families, they feel heavier. They feel like grief being multiplied for public consumption. The suspect remains mostly silent through all of this, refusing to provide a full confession, refusing to explain, and that refusal becomes a final insult that no sentence can correct, because the family realizes there will never be a neat narrative, no cinematic reveal, no dramatic why. Just a man who took and then hid, and even now trapped, he still controls the one thing they want most. The explanation that might let their minds stop circling. Sometimes the family imagines confronting him, not in a courtroom, not through lawyers, but directly eye to eye, asking the simplest question with the most impossible weight. Why did you do it? And in that imagined confrontation, they picture him finally breaking, finally offering remorse, finally giving them something that resembles humanity. But reality is colder. Reality is paperwork and prison walls and guarded visits and carefully worded statements. Reality is knowing that a person can live an entire life without ever giving you the truth you deserve. The solved case begins to change the way people talk about justice in broader terms, not just locally, but in meetings, conferences, training rooms where detectives and forensic specialists point to 1989 and say, this is why we invest in DNA, this is why genetic genealogy matters, this is why databases matter. And in those discussions, the case becomes part of a larger cultural shift, where the past is no longer considered unreachable, where time is no longer accepted as an excuse. But every advancement carries a shadow, and critics raise questions again about privacy, about the power of genetic searching, about the way relatives can be pulled into investigations without consent, and the public debates these issues with the distance of people who are not living inside a 34-year wound, people who can afford to treat it like philosophy, while the family knows that the philosophical costs are real, but so is the reality of a killer finally facing consequence. On an ordinary afternoon, years after the arrest but still close enough that the story hasn't settled fully, the family visits the victim's resting place, not as a ceremonial act for cameras, but as a private ritual, and the air is still, the kind of stillness that feels like the start of a memory, and they speak softly, not about court dates or DNA or headlines, but about life, about what they wish they could have said, about what they wish the victim could have seen. And in those quiet words, you can hear the true shape of closure. Not triumph, not resolution, but the act of continuing despite damage. They leave flowers. They stand longer than they planned. They walk away slowly. And in that slow walk, the camera you imagine in your mind doesn't pull back to show a triumphant ending. It stays close on the human faces, because this story, for all its headlines and breakthroughs, was never really about science. It was about the way time can stretch suffering, the way silence can become a second weapon, the way a community can carry an unresolved fear like a low hum for decades. Even now, people still talk about the night in 1989 with a kind of reverence, as if naming it keeps it contained, as if discussing it in past tense prevents it from happening again. And yet the truth is more unsettling. Solved cases don't just close doors, they open new ones, doors to deeper questions about how many other killers are walking free, how many other families are waiting, how many other evidence bags are sitting in cold storage holding answers that no one has asked the right way. Yet, the detectives continue their work because once you solve one cold case, you can't unsee the others, you can't forget the faces in old photographs, you can't ignore the feeling that justice is a moving target that depends on resources, on attention, on technology, and most of all on someone refusing to accept that the past is finished. And as the years stack up beyond 34, beyond the famous number that anchors this story, beyond the dramatic headline, the case becomes something else too. A warning carved into time itself. Evidence can wait, truth can wait, but grief doesn't wait. Grief lives in every day that passes without answers, and even when answers finally arrive, the cost of waiting remains. In prison, the suspect's body grows older, and one day he will die there. And when that day comes, the family will feel something complicated, not relief, not joy, something closer to the closing of a chapter that was never satisfying. Because death does not equal understanding, and understanding is what they were truly robbed of, the explanation that would make the world feel less random, less cruel. The cold case is solved, the system says. The DNA breakthrough exposed the killer, the headlines say. But in the quiet hours, the story still breathes, not as mystery anymore, but as a lingering ache, because some truths arrive late, and even when they arrive, they don't bring back what time has already taken. And somewhere in a box of files or a lab's freezer or a department's forgotten shelf, another case waits, another family waits, another silence waits to be broken. And the people who lived through California 1989 know now, in their bones, that time doesn't erase darkness, it only hides it until the day something science, persistence, or a single overlooked detail finally drags it into the light. Years pass after the last ruling, not in a dramatic montage, not in sweeping music, but in the slow, almost insulting ordinary rhythm of life, workdays, traffic, grocery lines, rain that comes and goes, new families moving into old neighborhoods, and yet the California 1989 cold case remains like a low-frequency hum under everything, quiet enough to ignore if you try, loud enough to feel when the world goes still. The community changes faces. Kids grow up and leave. Older neighbors move away. New residents arrive with no memory of the night police lights stained the street blue and red. No memory of the whispers, the fear. The sense that something had entered the neighborhood and refused to leave. They learn the story later, casually, from a local who can't resist telling it, from a news clip resurfacing online, from the way one address carries an invisible weight that real estate listings never mention, and when they hear it, they react the way outsiders always do, wide eyes, disbelief, a shiver, because outsiders can afford to be shocked for a moment and then move on. The people who lived through it cannot move on that cleanly. For them, the case isn't just a solved crime, it's a marker in time, a dividing line between before and after. And even with the killer identified, convicted, contained, the shadow lingers, because shadows don't vanish simply because you name the thing that cast them. The victim's family learns this slowly. In the way grief evolves after decades of being locked in one position. They stop waking up with the same urgent question that dominated their lives: who did it, why did it happen, will we ever know? And that absence should feel like relief, but it sometimes feels like emptiness because the question, painful as it was, gave their suffering a shape, and now the shape has changed, leaving them with something harder to define. A life rebuilt around loss that no longer has an active mystery to chase. They still carry the victim into every room they enter. They still notice the empty space in family photos that were never taken. They still speak the victim's name and feel that strange blend of tenderness and ache. Because time has not replaced love. It has only layered it with years of endurance. The difference now is that they can remember without the constant electric sting of uncertainty, and that is its own form of progress, small, imperfect, real. And sometimes, in private, they allow themselves to feel something close to satisfaction, not happiness, never that, but the quiet knowledge that the killer did not win completely. He stole a life, he stole decades from them, but he did not take the truth forever. The truth found him. The truth waited in darkness and then rose like a blade, sharp enough to cut through time. Investigators who work the reinvestigation eventually rotate out, retire, move on to other units, other cases, other tragedies, but they carry this one with them because it represents both the best and worst of the job. The best because persistence and science can resurrect justice, the worst because justice can arrive so late it feels like it's limping. In training rooms, new detectives hear the story as a lesson, a cautionary tale about evidence preservation, about never dismissing small samples, about never letting a cold case become an abandoned case. In labs, technicians talk about the breakthrough not as a miracle, but as proof of the importance of procedure, of chain of custody, of meticulous storage, because one mislabeled bag, one mishandled swab, one evidence locker that fails temperature control, and the voice of the dead goes silent again. The case becomes a reminder that the future depends on what you do in the present, that science can only speak if you give it something to work with. Somewhere along the way, the story becomes part of the broader cultural mythology of crime and justice. Another example used in documentaries, articles, and late-night discussions about genetic genealogy, about cold cases cracking open after decades, about the world changing in ways that finally make old crimes solvable. People debate it like an idea, like a concept, like a phenomenon, and the family learns to live with that too, because they have no power over what the story becomes once it enters the public bloodstream. But there's a moment years later when the story returns without warning, not through media, not through court, but through a simple human collision. Someone approaches one of the family members in a grocery store, recognizes them, says, "I remember that case." And for a second the world tilts, because you can feel how the past sits just beneath the surface, waiting for any touch to bring it back. The family member nods politely, says yes, and the stranger says something meant as comfort. "At least you got closure." At least. Closure. Words that sound gentle to someone outside, words that sound like a conclusion, but to the family they land with a complicated weight, because closure is not a door that locks and stays locked. Closure is a room you return to again and again, each time with a slightly different understanding of what was lost. They smile. They thank the stranger. They walk away. And inside, the truth remains. Closure didn't come like peace. Closure came like a verdict and a sentence and a name on a paper and a face in a mugshot. And the peace, if it exists, is partial, fragile, earned day by day in quiet routines. In prison, the killer grows older, his world shrinking as his body shrinks. And one day he becomes another file in another system. Medical reports, infirmary visits, the slow fate of a life that once moved freely through sunlight. If he ever speaks fully, it isn't public. If he ever confesses, it isn't dramatic. If he ever explains why, it isn't satisfying. The why remains like smoke, drifting, refusing to settle into something solid enough to hold. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of the case, that the law can deliver a conclusion while the human heart still demands a reason. People want a motive because motive makes evil feel containable, because motive suggests logic, because logic suggests prevention. But the absence of motive leaves the community with a harsher truth, that some violence emerges from places we cannot map, that danger does not always announce itself in predictable patterns. And that is why this case, even solved, still chills. The community holds memorials on certain anniversaries, not for cameras, not for publicity, but because ritual is how humans fight the erasure of time. They light candles. They say the victim's name. They remember small things, the way the victim smiled, the way they walked, the way their presence filled a room. They refuse to let the story become only about the killer, because killers love that, love being the central figure, love being remembered as the force that changed everything. So the community chooses to center the victim instead. And this choice matters because it turns the story away from fascination and back toward humanity, back toward the thing that was actually stolen. There are nights still when someone in that neighborhood hears a noise outside, a footstep, a car door, a distant shout, and the old fear rises like instinct, and they remember the night in 1989 when silence was broken by violence, and they remember how long it took for the world to name the person responsible. This memory is not paranoia. It's imprint. The psychological scar of knowing evil can be quiet. But there is another imprint too, one that is harder to see but just as real. The knowledge that patience and science can tear holes in time, that the past is not untouchable, that evidence preserved can become a voice decades later, and that somewhere right now there are other cases waiting for the same kind of resurrection. That's the lingering echo of California 1989. Not just fear, but insistence. Insistence that cold cases are not dead, just dormant. Insistence that truth can survive in darkness if someone refuses to stop looking. Insistence that justice is not a moment, it's a pursuit. And in the final quiet image of this story, there is no courtroom, no flashing lights, no headline, just a street at night under soft street lamps, houses asleep behind closed blinds, the air calm, ordinary, almost peaceful, and somewhere within that calm lies the memory of how fragile peace can be, and also the memory of how long truth can wait. Because the cold case was solved, yes. The DNA breakthrough exposed the killer after 34 years, yes. But what remains is the deeper lesson that no headline can fully capture. That time is not an eraser, it is a hiding place, and sometimes if you are patient enough, if you preserve enough, if you refuse to let the past stay silent, you can reach into that hiding place and pull the truth out, cold, sharp, undeniable. So the dead are no longer asking into darkness, and the living are no longer answering with silence.